Hi, boys and girls. Glad to see you this Sunday morning. We're going to start with our memory verse that comes from 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 11. And it says, Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord. Our Bible point is that God used bad things to teach his people, and we can learn from our mistakes too. We're going to read from chapter 14 in our storybook today. And it says, a kingdom torn in two. So the Lord said to Solomon, you have chosen not to keep my covenant. You have decided not to obey my rules. I command you to do what I told you, but you did not do it. So you can be absolutely sure I will tear the kingdom away from you. I will give it to one of your officials. 1 Kings 11:11. The wisest man on earth wasn't always wise. As King Solomon grew older, he began to make bad choices. He married many women who worshipped idols. Instead of leading them to love God, Solomon let his wives talk him into worshiping their idols. After Solomon's rule ended, the peace and prosperity of the nation ended too. A dark time began in Israel's history. Men fought over who would be the next king. The kingdom divided, and a long string of evil kings began to rule the nations. Occasionally, a good king would come to the throne and call the people back to God. Good kings, bad kings. God was very disappointed with Solomon. Since you have disobeyed me and worshipped other gods, I will tear this kingdom away from you, God told the king. God was angry with Solomon. The people of Israel were angry too. For years, Solomon had demanded huge taxes from them. This made the people poor, and many of them had turned away from God in discouragement, worshiping false gods instead. Just as God had promised, he split the kingdom of Israel into two nations, Israel and Judah. For the next 350 years, God's chosen people did not follow God's rules for holy living. Most of the time, they were led by evil kings who worshiped idols instead of the one true God. One good king of Judah, King Asa, tried hard to bring the people back to worshiping God. Asa got rid of the false idols. He brought gold and silver to the temple to show honor to God. Just as Asa tried to do good, King Ahab of Israel seemed determined to do the most evil. He and his wife Jezebel encouraged the people to worship the idol Baal. Their actions were more evil than all the other bad kings combined. It was a sad time for the nation that had been led by so many faithful men. So King Solomon was gone, and there were a lot of bad kings that took over Israel, and God split the nation of Israel. He split it into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. The first king of Israel was Saul. He was tall and handsome and popular, but he turned out not to be a very good leader. Next came David. David was a great king. Sure, he made some mistakes, but he was sorry for them, and he wanted to show his love for God more and more. Then came David's son Solomon. Solomon started out as a great king who followed God's ways, but as the years went by, he started making a lot of mistakes. By the end, he was really messed up, and he wasn't really sorry. He had stopped worshiping God and no longer led the people in following God. When Solomon died, the kingdom where God's people lived started breaking apart. When Solomon's son Rehoboam became king, the first thing he did was make the people mad at him. Obviously, he didn't get his dad's wisdom. So most of the people decided to start a new country, and God let them make a man named Jeroboam their king. Jeroboam wasn't very smart either. He let the people in the new country worship idols, things that were not the one true God. And that was a mistake. The country Rehoboam ruled was called Judah, and the kingdom Jeroboam ruled was called Israel. For the most part, the kings and people of Israel and Judah were very sinful. They worshipped all the wrong things, like sacred stones and Asherah poles. These idols were not the one true God. The people made mistake after mistake. God would have to show them He was more powerful than their idols. He used bad things to teach His people that they should be following Him. Kings from other countries attacked God's people and carried away their treasures. But still, the people didn't learn their lessons. Everything in Judah and Israel was falling apart. In addition to fighting the kings around them, Jeroboam and Rehoboam were fighting each other too. And when they died, their evil sons took the thrones and kept up the fighting. That was a mistake. For the most part, Israel was a big pit of sin. No matter who was king, the people there kept sinning and putting up more idols, which only made God angrier and angrier. But the people refused to learn the lessons God wanted to teach. They kept on doing all the wrong things. But there was some hope for Judah. Occasionally, there was a king who loved God and who tried to be a good king like David. The first one of these kings was Asa. He was ready to learn from the bad things that kept happening. Asa knew that God had been trying to teach His people something, and he wanted to pay attention. He got rid of all the statues and the false gods the kings before him had made. He even took his grandmother out of her job as queen, mother, because she made a pole to worship the goddess Asherah. Asa cut it down the pole and burned it up. Everything he did focused on learning from mistakes and trying to turn Judah around to be a country that worshiped God again. King Asa didn't get rid of every single place where false worships happened, but he committed his whole life to completely to the Lord. He brought silver and gold and other valuable things to the Lord's temple to honor God. As usual, the evil king of Israel wanted to fight a war against Judah. Asa had a feeling that King Baasha wanted to take all of God's treasures out of the temple. Asa definitely did not want Baasha to use these holy things to worship idols. That would be another mistake. He got the king of another country, Aram, to fight with him against Israel. The two parts of God's people went to war against each other again. Then Asa invaded Israel, and his soldiers carried away all the stones and wood Baasha had been using there. Asa used this to build up the cities of Judah. Asa knew that kings before him had made a lot of mistakes, but he thought the people could learn from their mistakes. It wasn't too late to change. It wasn't too late to serve God. It wasn't too late to worship the one true God. Asa was one of the best kings Judah had seen in a long time. But God's kingdom had been destroyed despite everything Asa did to save it. Israel and Judah had broken apart and would never come back together to be the strong kingdom they had been under David. So God's people went through some tough times, but God uses every hard time to teach us how to live His way. So boys and girls, even though we go through hard times or things are tough or we think we can't do it, God is using it to teach us a lesson. We just have to learn from our mistakes and learn from those hard times what He wants us to learn. Maybe when we get in trouble, God wants us to learn to be kinder or to share or to love others no matter what they do to us. So remember, boys and girls, Live for God. Worship only Him. The things of this world are just the things of this world. Let's be wise and love God like King David and like Solomon started out loving God and being wise. Have a great week, boys and girls.